Hello students, welcome to BBA 204, Principles of Management. This is your professor Mine Doyran for this class. Today I will be covering chapter 2, which is about the history and the evolution of management thinking. So we will be looking at the historical forces that influence the practice of management. So, so the history of management thinking deals with the question of, are you a new style or an old style manager? So to be able to answer this question, we need to look at the management history that helps your conceptual skills to understand the social, political, and the economic forces that influence the practice of management. So the importance of this chapter is such that we need to look at the social and the political context of management. For instance, we are talking about more and more today inclusion of diversity in management. Diversity is the catchword in management nowadays, especially in our hiring decisions and human resource management decisions. Where does the word diversity historically come from in the United States? So companies are trying to hire people from different backgrounds to make the workforce a more diverse environment. So people from different backgrounds such as race, ethnicity, religion, and disability. Why are we paying attention to diversity issues? So to be able to answer this question, I think it is important to look at the social and political forces that demanded and fought for more and more inclusion, equality, and justice during the 1960s. So one of the examples of these social forces is the civil rights movement. I think civil rights movement is a very good example of the social as well as a political force that shaped our understanding of how and what diversity means and how we should include more and more diversity in our management practices. Okay? So, three major historical forces are social, political, and economic. Social forces are the aspects of a culture that guide and influence relationships among people. So, what do people value? What do people need? What are the standards of behavior among people? These forces shape the social contract, the unwritten common rules and perceptions about relationships among people and between employees and management. For example, a typical example for a social force today is the changing attitudes, ideas, and the values of the new generation called Generation Y employees. I think the notion of Generation Y employees is a very good example of a social force that is taking place today. So Generation Y refers to young, educated, technologically adept, and globally conscious generation, right? So political forces rather influence political and legal institutions on people and organizations. One example of a political force is the government, right? Or the increased role of government in business. Political forces include basic assumptions underlying the political system, such as property rights, contract rights and justice, fair and equal representation. Economic forces, on the other hand, pertain to the availability of production and distribution of resources in a society. Some examples of economic forces include financial crisis, economic growth, inflation, deflation, unemployment, exchange rate, oil prices, consumer spending. Okay? So let's look at the major developments in the history of the management tool. So we come up with three major perspectives that have evolved since the late 1800s, which includes the classical perspective, the humanistic perspective, and the management science. The classical perspective emerged during the 19th and early 20th centuries. So it emerged with the rise of the factory system, workplace, and the society becoming more complex, more modernized. So we had new issues and problems regarding the structure, training, and employee satisfaction, right? Therefore, large, complex organizations required new approaches to management and control in the workplace. Hence, the rationale for the classical perspective. So classical perspective, under the classical perspective, we have three subfields: scientific management, bureaucratic organizations, and administrative principles. Now let's describe each perspective. Okay, right? So basically, we were talking about the procedures, right? Slide number 5. Slide number 5. The procedures, what do the procedures involve? The procedures should be developed in order to improve efficiency and labor productivity. As you can clearly see, the emphasis in scientific management is very efficiency oriented, right? And the management decisions should be based on precise procedures that measure the labor productivity and efficiency. Okay. Some of the examples for scientific management, if you look at the history behind who developed, who introduced the scientific management thinking, we need to look at thinkers like Henry Gantt, who developed the Gantt chart to measure and plan work. Although Taylor is often known as the father of scientific management, Henry Gantt, an associate of Taylor's, developed the Gantt chart. So what is the Gantt chart about? Gantt chart is a bar graph that measures planned and completed work along each stage of production by time elapsed. And then we have Gilbreth, right? Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who pioneered time and motion studies to promote efficiency in the workplace. So Frank Gilbreth's study had great impact on medical surgery by drastically reducing the time that patients spend on the operating table. And then we had Lillian Gilbreth was more interested in the human aspect of work. She pioneered in the field of industrial psychology and made substantial contributions to human resource management down the road. Here are some characteristics of scientific management: the general approach, which we have just discussed, and the contributions to the field, and this criticisms that the scientific management received down the road. Some of the arguments that this approach has been subjected to is the following, right? The scientific approach ignores the social context and the workers' needs. It kind of ignores the complexities of real life, like how people work and make a living in real life. It ignores differences among the workers. So it can also lead to increased conflict and clashes between managers and employees. One example for the failure of scientific management is, think about these schools reopening plans. There is no really clear roadmap to the reopening plans of the schools. So we all thought that, each school thought that under this challenge of COVID-19, we would reopen the schools if we follow a very rigid scientific plan and procedure. But as the life goes on, we see that there are a lot of complexities and the problems, a lot of failures in the school's reopening plans, a lot of contingencies, right? So I think school opening is a very good example of the problems in disaster management, right? There is no clear and easy path to schools reopening. Even if we follow the scientific principles in trying to make our workplace, a very safe environment, even though we follow the scientific principles, there is no easy roadmap to reopening. Okay? A lot of schools like St. John, Notre Dame, North Carolina have put money and effort into reopening plans. They try to bring COVID-19 technology, the most recent technology, to campus. But some of the ways in which they proceeded led to a clash between the faculty and the administrators, right? So this shows you that it is not that easy to implement the scientific approach in the real world. Okay? And I think the management of COVID-19 and the schools reopening plans is a very interesting example of gray areas in scientific management. There is no right or wrong, but there are gray areas and there is no real or clear roadmap to the reopening of the campuses, right? And then we have the second approach introduced by Max Weber, who was a German theorist. He introduced the notion of the bureaucratic organizations. Basically, uh, basically looking at the organization as a whole, right? Uh, Max Weber argued that all businesses, in a way, all businesses, including public and private organizations, are bureaucratic entities because they are managed according to rules, procedures, record keeping that are also impersonal. Okay? So organizations are managed on an impersonal and rational basis. They also depend on rules and record keeping. So basically, Max Weber's key notion was that management is impersonal, rational system. It is built on clearly defined authority and responsibility. It is built on formal record keeping and also the separation of management and ownership. So this is a very, very important notion that he introduced. And most of the modern management thinkers introduced that management or in the modern business organization is built on the separation of management and ownership, meaning that managers act on behalf of shareholders by improving the bottom line of the company. Okay? Basically, managers defend the interests of the shareholders. Therefore, there should be no conflict of interest between the shareholders and the managers. Therefore, managers should be independent. They should be separately and independently hired. They should not be related to any of the shareholders like a family member, right? If there is a family member in the company who is both a shareholder and a manager, right? So there might be a conflict of interest between the managers and the shareholders. So ideally, every modern bureaucratic organization should be based on this separation in the sense that the managers should be independently hired, independent of the family that, that owns the company, or independent of the shareholders who own the company. Okay? Managers use power instead of personality to delegate authority for important productivity gains, right? For example, some people argue that UPS is a very successful bureaucracy because of its rules and regulations, well-defined division of labor, and technical qualifications as a primary hiring criterion. Here are some of the characteristics of Weberian bureaucracy. So I won't go into details explaining each dimension here, but please carefully look at these different components of the Weberian bureaucracy to understand the importance of what division of labor means, what rational authority means, the importance of hierarchy, rules and procedures, written decisions, promotion based on technical qualifications, not personal or arbitrary criterion, and also the importance of ownership and management. Okay? And the final perspective under the classical approach uh, is basically the administrative perspective, right? We have the administrative perspective that focuses on the total organization rather than the individual worker. So Henry Fayol was a main contributor to the administrative perspective, who was a French mining engineer, right? He introduced 14 general principles of management. The unity of command, which argues that each employee should have only one boss. Each employee should have only one boss. Division of worker, which argue that specialized employees produce more with the same effort. So in other words, if each worker is specialized in a particular task, overall productivity will increase. For example, assembly line production is a very good example of efficient division of labor or division of work. The third one is the unity of direction, which argue that similar activities should be grouped under one manager. Okay? So unity of direction argues that similar activities should be grouped under one manager. So, for instance, accounting, auditing, and budget activities are grouped under accounting or finance manager. The last one, the scalar chain, is a chain of authority that extends from the top of an organization, right? So the term scalar refers to the authority that extends from the top of an organization. For instance, CEO gives orders to middle managers, who then give orders to lower level managers. Okay? So basically, Fayol felt that these principles could be applied in any organizational setting. He was also the one to have identified 5 basic functions of management: planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. And then here is a new perspective, the humanistic perspective, which sort of appeared or emerged as a challenge to the earlier perspective, the classical perspective. So at one point, the classical perspective couldn't fail to fully understand the behavior in the workplace, right? So the whole purpose in the classical perspective, including scientific, bureaucratic perspective, was to increase labor productivity. But what happens if the labor is not as productive as the classical perspective predicted? Okay? Therefore, we need to understand the human behavior, needs, and attitudes in the workplace. We cannot think that humans can be tooled and retooled like machines. It's very important to understand the human behavior, needs, and the attitudes in the workplace. Hence the rationale for the humanistic perspective. So the early advocates of the humanistic perspective was Mary Parker Follett and Chester Barnard, right? So they argued that people are more important than pure efficiency or labor productivity. So they emphasize the importance of people rather than the engineering techniques. So you will see that there will be 3 subfields three subfields within the humanistic perspective, which include the human relations movement, the human resources perspective, and the behavioral sciences approach. So there are three subfields: human relations movement, the human resources perspective, and the behavioral sciences approach. Basically, Parker was important because Mary Parker emphasized empowerment in the workplace, which refers to the notion of facilitating instead of controlling, right? Facilitating rather than controlling employees and allowing employees to express themselves and to act according to the needs of the situation. Okay? So Barnard, for instance, and the contribution of Barnard was such that he contributed to the concept of the informal organization, right? He argued that informal relations occur in all formal organizations and includes cliques, alliances, social groupings, right? The concepts in the yellow marking here, the concepts in yellow marking, were emphasized by Chester Barnard, who argued that informal relations occur in all formal organizations, including cliques, alliances, social groupings, right? So the people are not machines, and that informal relationships are powerful forces that can help the organizations if properly managed. Barnard also introduced the acceptance of authority. So this is the notion that employees have free will and can choose whether to follow management orders or not. So we are not blindly following the management orders. What if the management orders are not correct? What if the management orders are not very transparent, or are not correct, or are not honest, right? So we have the free will to choose whether to follow the management orders or not. Okay? The second perspective, or the second subfield in this approach, the humanistic perspective, the second subfield is the human relations movement, right, which argues that the effective control comes within the employee. So the most important contribution of the human relations movement was the Hawthorne studies. The Hawthorne studies, basically, Hawthorne studies showed that employees performed better when managers treated them positively. Okay, so what were the Hawthorne studies about? The Hawthorne studies were about a series of experiments on worker productivity at the Hawthorne plant of Western Electric Company, Chicago. The tests were originally designed to investigate the effects of lightening on output, the effects of illumination and improved lighting on output, right? However, contrary to the expectations of the tests, the researchers found that employees performed better when managers treated them positively. So it wasn't the improved lighting or the effects of illumination necessarily, but it was the human relations that played a key variable in increasing the performance and the productivity. For instance, how managers treated the workers, how managers allowed employee participation in decision making were the factors that contributed to improved productivity. So the Hawthorne studies discovered that the workers were highly responsive to additional attention from their managers and the feeling that their managers actually cared about and were interested in their work. Okay? The studies also found that although financial incentives and money are important, social issues are more important factors in worker productivity, such as desire to belong to a group and to be included in decision making and work. Okay? Finally, we have the under the humanistic perspective, we have the final subfield, the behavioral sciences approach. The behavioral sciences approach is the third perspective under the humanistic perspective, an approach that applies social science in organizational contexts, and it draws from many disciplines such as economics, sociology, psychology, and anthropology to develop theories about human behavior and interaction in an organizational setting. So think about a company like Zappos, for instance. When a Zappos conducts research to determine the best set of tests, interviews, and employee profiles to use when selecting new employees, it is using behavioral science techniques. Okay, so the Zappos' use of tests, interviews, and employee profiles when hiring new employees is a good example for this behavioral science technique. One set of management techniques based in the behavioral science approach is also known as organizational development. Organizational development is a field that uses behavioral sciences to improve the organization. Again, organizational development uses also a number of techniques to improve worker productivity in the workplace. They use, for instance, something known as matrix organizations or self-managed teams, ideas about corporate culture, and management by wandering around. It's also known as management by walking around. Okay? In matrix organizations, there is dual or multiple managerial accountability and responsibility, right? For instance, one manager is responsible for two managerial roles, right? For instance, a manager can be a marketing manager and a project managers at the same time. So we're really talking about dual or multiple managerial responsibility. In a self-managed team, we're really talking about a group of employees that is responsible and accountable for all aspects of producing a service, right? These workers work as a group or collective rather than individually to undertake a special task. The notion of the corporate culture, something that the behavioral sciences approach introduced, refers to the beliefs and the behaviors that determine how a company's employees and management interact and handle outside business transaction. And finally, the final concept that the behavioral sciences approach introduces is something known as the management by wandering around, also known as management by walking around. This happens, for instance, when a manager walks around the office, make informal visits, and listen to the employees. So generally, when a manager wanders around, he or she walks in a very unstructured manner, through the workplaces at random, right, to check with the employees, equipment, or the status of ongoing work. Okay, thanks for listening to my lecture so far. So in part one of my lecture, I covered the classical perspective, which included three subfields, and I also included the humanistic perspective, which included three subfields. And now I'm going to start with a new perspective known as quantitative perspective, and I will continue to discuss this perspective in part two of my lecture. Again, thanks for listening to my lecture so far. See you in part 2. Thank you.